Welcome back to Poirot Files. Today, we're diving into an intriguing mystery, Hercule Poirot and the gambler who won a losing bet, a tale of deception, secrets, and Poirot's brilliant investigative mind. But before that, I want to say, you've shown me so much love and I truly appreciate it. Let us know where you're tuning in from, grab your coffee, and let's get started. Chapter 1. The Curious Invitation. It was a crisp autumn evening in London, the kind of evening that seems to whisper secrets in the winds of the city. The last traces of sunlight had long since disappeared, leaving the streets bathed in a soft golden glow from the gas lamps. As I sat in my modest sitting room, reading through the newspaper, the stillness of the evening was suddenly broken by a soft knock at the door. "Mon ami, it is for you," came the voice of my friend, Hercule Poirot, his small but commanding figure filling the doorway. I glanced up from my paper, slightly surprised. "For me? Who would be visiting at this hour?" Poirot's eyes twinkled mischievously. "That, my dear Hastings, is a question I intend to answer. The letter was left at your doorstep and it is addressed to none other than yourself." He handed me the letter with a flourish, his moustache twitching ever so slightly as if he already knew its contents. I took the envelope, feeling its weight in my hand, and broke the seal. Inside was a simple card, elegantly embossed with gold lettering. It read, "Mr. Captain Hastings, you are cordially invited to attend an exclusive and rather confidential game of poker hosted at the Leclerc Club tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. The stakes are high and the risks are even higher. I trust you will not disappoint me by turning down this invitation. Yours faithfully, Felix Leclerc." The name struck me immediately. Felix Leclerc, a name associated with scandal, high-stakes gambling, and rumors of debts so large that even the most ruthless of men had begun to shy away from him. It was not the sort of invitation one would expect to receive lightly. Well, what do you make of this, Poirot?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. Poirot took a seat across from me, his expression thoughtful, and for a brief moment he simply stared at the letter. Intriguing, no? But what is the purpose of this invitation, Hastings? It is not simply a request to join a game of chance. A man such as Felix Leclerc does not extend such an offer without a reason. There is something beneath the surface. I am certain of it. I leaned back in my chair, considering his words. "Do you think it's a trap?" Poirot's lips curled slightly at the edges, the hint of a smile tugging at them. "Perhaps, or perhaps not. But a man who invites a detective to a game may not be so fond of the idea of losing, n'est-ce pas? No, Hastings, this is more than a mere game of cards. There is something much more important at stake." I glanced at the letter again, the boldness of the invitation making me uneasy. Felix Leclerc. The name carries quite a reputation. He's not exactly a man to be trusted. Poirot nodded gravely, his fingers steepling as he thought. Leclerc has a history of making enemies, but no one can deny his skills at the table. He is a man who understands the art of deception, and it would be wise to remember that when we step into his world tomorrow evening. "Then you'll be coming with me?" I asked, not entirely sure if I was more relieved or troubled by the thought. Poirot gave a small shrug, as if the decision had already been made in his mind. "Of course, mon ami. Where you go, I go. Besides, I have no intention of leaving you to navigate this game of chance without the aid of my little grey cells." I could not help but smile. I suppose I should be grateful. Poirot's expression softened, though his eyes never lost their sharpness. "Ah, Hastings, it is not so much gratitude as it is necessity. A man such as Leclerc is not to be underestimated. But remember, this game is not just about the cards. It is about understanding the man himself, his motives, and the truths he seeks to hide. A moment of silence passed between us, and I found myself strangely on edge, despite Poirot's calm demeanour. There was something ominous about the entire situation, as though we were about to walk into a carefully laid trap. The invitation itself seemed too perfect, too calculated. "And you think he's hiding something?" I asked, the question hanging in the air. Poirot's lips twitched again, the faintest of smiles appearing as he leaned forward slightly. "Oh, mon ami, when you are invited to a game like this, you may rest assured that the stakes are not merely monetary. There is always more at play than the obvious. That is the first rule of high society and of any good game." Before I could reply, there was another knock at the door, more insistent this time. Poirot stood and crossed the room with his usual grace, opening the door to reveal a young woman, pale and visibly nervous. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tremulous. I was told to deliver this to Captain Hastings." She handed me another envelope, and I took it with a raised brow. This was beginning to feel like something out of a novel, a game of intrigue where each move seemed to be orchestrated by unseen hands. Poirot studied the woman for a moment before addressing her. "You may go, mademoiselle," he said gently, offering her a reassuring smile. "There is no need for alarm. You have done your part." The woman nodded quickly and hurried off, leaving us alone again with the envelope. I tore it open and found another card inside, this one more cryptic than the first. It read, "The game tomorrow will change your life, Captain Hastings. Do not come alone. Someone will be watching." I glanced up at Poirot, whose expression had darkened considerably. He raised a hand as though to ward off further thought. This changes things. "Who would be watching?" I asked, feeling a growing unease. Poirot's face was unreadable, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind. "That, mon ami, is something we shall soon discover. But one thing is certain, this invitation is no mere social call. It is a summons, Hastings, a summons to something far more dangerous than a simple game of cards." And with that, the evening's peaceful atmosphere shattered. As I pondered the strange words on the card, I could not shake the feeling that we had just been drawn into a web of intrigue far larger than either of us could yet understand. The stage was set. The game was about to begin. Chapter 2. The Game of Deception. The evening was just as Poirot had predicted, nothing like the quiet autumn night we had left behind. The streets of London seemed to close in on us as we made our way to the Leclerc Club. The city, draped in its cloak of shadows and mist, gave off an air of secrets lurking in every corner. My unease only grew as the club's massive wrought-iron gates loomed before us, guarded by two stern men whose eyes studied us with an almost unnerving intensity. Poirot's steps were light, almost dainty, and his presence was as unmistakable as ever. "Ah, Hastings, we are entering the lion's den now, but fear not. It is only the lion who should be afraid." I nodded absently, trying to shake off the sense that something inescapable was waiting for us on the other side. Inside, the club was nothing short of magnificent. The walls were lined with dark mahogany, the floors gleamed under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the faint hint of aged brandy. We were led through a narrow hallway, past doors that whispered secrets and rumours until we arrived at a private, opulent room. At the centre of it was a large oval table surrounded by 6 men, all of whom looked as though they had stepped straight out of a financial district. Well-dressed, sharp-eyed, their faces impassive, and yet there was a subtle undercurrent of tension that one could not ignore. Felix Leclerc stood at the head of the table, his features carefully arranged in the form of a smile, but his eyes were calculating, cold, like a man used to having everything under control. He was the kind of man who knew how to manipulate others, a man whose wealth and reputation were built on the precarious balance of risk and deceit. "Ah, mon ami, Captain Hastings, and of course the great Hercule Poirot," Leclerc greeted us, his voice smooth and full of the polished charm of a man who had perfected the art of making others feel both welcome and uneasy. "It is an honor to have you both with us. I trust the evening finds you in good health?" Poirot gave a courteous nod, his moustache twitching slightly. "Thank you, Monsieur Leclerc. It is most intriguing to be invited to such an event. And to a game of such high stakes," Leclerc added with a glimmer in his eye. "Perhaps too high for some, but not for us, eh? We are all men of honor here." I felt my discomfort grow. The way he spoke, as though the game were already decided, set my nerves on edge. "Allow me to introduce the other players," Leclerc continued, gesturing around the table. "We have Sir Henry Cartwright, an esteemed member of Parliament. His poker face is as steady as his political career. Next, the charming Lady Evelyn Thorne, who needs no introduction, I'm sure. She's quite the strategist, though her games are often played with a different sort of finesse. And then there's Lord Gregory Ashford, a man of few words, but who knows when to make his move." As he spoke, I studied each of the men in turn. Sir Henry Cartwright was the epitome of the stiff upper lip aristocrat, his back ramrod straight, his face etched with lines of disapproval or calculation, I couldn't quite tell. Lady Evelyn was the type of woman who seemed to know the effect she had on people. She flirted with everyone in the room, yet I couldn't shake the suspicion that her flirtations were as much a weapon as they were a tool of manipulation. Lord Gregory Ashford, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, was a study in contrast. His piercing eyes held secrets, and I had no doubt he knew more than he was letting on. The final two players were unknown to me, though their presence seemed just as deliberate. One was a tall, dark-haired man who went by the name of Julian Beckett, and the other was a younger man, Thomas Webber, who looked out of place but spoke in a voice that suggested a great deal of confidence. As we settled into our seats, the room took on an air of quiet anticipation. The first few hands passed without incident, each player adopting the familiar rhythms of a game that had long since stopped being about mere chance and had become instead an intricate dance of lies and half-truths. Some point Poirot leaned in, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "There is something strange about all of this, Hastings. These men, they are not merely here to play cards. No, their stakes are higher than mere money. It is the control they seek, the power, the influence, and perhaps even the secrets of those around them." I nodded, feeling a growing sense of foreboding. There was an undercurrent to this game, an invisible tension that none of the players were willing to acknowledge, but that Poirot could already detect. The game progressed, each hand more intense than the last. Leclerc played with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, his eyes never leaving the cards as if he already knew the outcome. Lady Evelyn, for her part, seemed to be using her beauty as a shield, distracting her opponents with calculated glances and coy smiles. But beneath it all, I sensed a sharpness that belied her flirtations. Sir Henry Cartwright, stoic as ever, appeared to be playing only for the thrill of victory, though I couldn't shake the feeling that his mind was elsewhere. And then, just as the tension seemed to reach a breaking point, Leclerc made an announcement that stilled the room. "I will bet everything. he declared, his voice cool and calm, as if this were a common thing. "Every penny I have, and all of you shall witness it. A final hand, my friends." The room went silent. Even Poirot's sharp gaze seemed to falter for a moment. I could feel the air grow thick with suspicion. Everything. That word hung in the air like a portent of doom. There was something off about it. Even though the room was filled with experienced gamblers, this was not a wager that was made lightly, nor without some kind of hidden agenda. I watched as the men exchanged glances, some hesitant, others eager. But it was Lady Evelyn's eyes that caught mine. There was no fear in them, only a calculated curiosity. Poirot leaned toward me once again, his voice barely a whisper. "Mon ami, this is no longer a game of chance. This is a game of power, and I fear that Leclerc is playing a hand he cannot win." Just as I was about to respond, a loud crash echoed from the other side of the room. The game came to an abrupt halt. "Leclerc!" Sir Henry shouted, rising from his chair. "Leclerc, are you—" We all rushed to the source of the noise, and there, in a small side room, lay Felix Leclerc, his body sprawled unnaturally across the floor, his once immaculate suit now stained with blood. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured, kneeling beside the body. "He has been murdered." The shock in the room was palpable, but Poirot's mind was already working, his keen eyes scanning the room for the smallest detail. A man who plays so recklessly is often a man who hides something. But tell me, Hastings, what do you see? What is it that seems not quite right about this? I stepped closer, looking down at Leclerc's body, but it was Poirot's gaze that seemed to see everything. His eyes flitted over the details, the missing wallet, the faintest trace of blood leading toward the window, and most telling of all, the tension that still lingered in the air. "This is no random act of violence," Poirot said, standing and brushing the dust from his trousers. "No, this murder is part of the game, a game that is far from over." As the others began to gather in the room, murmuring amongst themselves, I could see that Poirot was already preparing his next move. The investigation had begun, and the pieces were already starting to fall into place. And as the door closed behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that the night was only just beginning. Chapter 3. The Dead Gambler's Secrets. The room where Felix Leclerc's body had been discovered had quickly filled with a stifling tension. The men, once so poised and controlled, now stood like statues, their eyes darting uneasily between one another. Sir Henry Cartwright, whose cool composure had been so evident throughout the evening, now looked troubled. The poker game had collapsed into something far darker than a mere contest of skill. A murder, a brutal one, and the man who had bet everything, seemingly on a whim, was now dead. Poirot's gaze swept the room, his sharp eyes taking in the smallest details. The body of Leclerc lay motionless, his hand outstretched toward the window, as though trying to make an escape that he never quite reached. A sense of unease seemed to permeate the air. But Poirot was unmoved, as if the scene before him was simply another puzzle to be solved. "It is as I suspected," Poirot murmured, leaning closer to the body. "Not a random act of violence, but a calculated move. Someone knew exactly what they were doing." I crouched beside him, looking down at Leclerc's still form. The coldness of death was evident, but there was something else that caught my attention. A faint discoloration on the back of his neck. Poirot's fingers brushed against it lightly, Then he raised his hand to his lips. "A mark, Hastings, a small puncture wound. Poison, perhaps? It is subtle, but unmistakable." I blinked, trying to process what he had just said. Poison? But how could anyone administer it without anyone noticing? Poirot straightened and gave a small, enigmatic smile. "Ah, that is the key, my friend. The poison was not meant to be noticed, but it was most certainly there. I suspect it was introduced in a very clever manner, perhaps in his drink, or—" His voice trailed off as he scanned the room, his mind already working through the possibilities. The other guests were still huddled in the corner, their faces drawn and tense. The murmurs had turned to whispers, but Poirot's gaze cut through, the tension like a knife. "Now we must speak to each of these gentlemen and the lady. To find the truth, we must begin with them." As Poirot turned to face the others, I could feel the weight of the investigation settling over me. This was no longer just a game of poker, no longer just the unfortunate death of a man who had made reckless bets. It was something deeper, darker. But what? Poirot stepped forward, his calm voice cutting through the air. "Gentlemen and Lady Evelyn, I must ask you all to remain here. There is much to discuss. We shall begin with Sir Henry." The aristocrat stood stiffly, his face a mask of composure. "I assure you, Poirot, I saw nothing unusual. The game proceeded as it always does. Leclerc made his bet, and I thought it rather foolish, but that was all." Poirot regarded him with a quiet intensity. "So you did not notice any strange behaviour? Any signs that Monsieur Leclerc was in distress? Or perhaps that he was involved in something that might have brought him harm?" Sir Henry shook his head, his jaw tightening. "No, I noticed nothing of the sort. It's absurd. He was fine one moment and the next." Poirot nodded, his lips curling into a small, thoughtful smile. "I see. And what of Lady Evelyn?" He gestured toward the woman in question, who had been standing quietly near the door, her hands trembling slightly. Lady Evelyn's eyes flickered nervously as she approached, her voice laced with a feigned calmness. I don't know what you want me to say, Monsieur Poirot. We were playing, as usual. I wasn't particularly close to Felix, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I just couldn't believe it when it happened. It was so sudden." Poirot's eyes studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Ah, but madame, you are quite nervous. You are not so calm as you appear. Tell me, did you perhaps notice anything unusual in Monsieur Leclerc's behaviour? Anything that might have suggested he was in danger?" Lady Evelyn hesitated, her fingers brushing nervously against the edge of her glass. No, I didn't," she finally murmured, avoiding his gaze. But Poirot's sharp eyes had already caught the subtle tremor in her voice, the way her breath hitched ever so slightly. "There is something you are not telling me, madame. You must be certain of this." Her lips parted as though she would protest, but instead she fell silent. Poirot turned away from her, his gaze moving to the next person. It was then that I noticed something odd on the floor near Leclerc's body. A single playing card. It was an ace of spades, face up, and placed deliberately near his outstretched hand. I picked it up and turned it over, unsure of its significance. "Poirot, what do you make of this?" I asked, holding up the card. "It seems rather conspicuous, doesn't it?" Poirot took the card from my hand, studying it closely before dismissing it with a wave. "Ah, mon ami, one cannot always trust the apparent." "A card? A mere coincidence, perhaps? Or a red herring, something to mislead us? But we must look beyond such distractions." I nodded, feeling a momentary wave of frustration. The card had seemed so telling, yet Poirot's words brought me back to the reality of the investigation. Every detail, every object in the room must be weighed carefully. Even something as seemingly insignificant as a playing card could have deeper meaning, or it could be nothing at all. Poirot's eyes then shifted to Lord Gregory Ashford, who had been watching the proceedings with an unreadable expression. "And you, Lord Ashford," Poirot began, his voice gentle but firm. "You've remained quiet this whole time. Perhaps there is something you know that could help us understand what happened to Monsieur Leclerc." Lord Ashford's lips tightened, his gaze flickering briefly to Lady Evelyn. Then, with a measured sigh, he spoke. "I know nothing more than anyone else here. I was simply playing the game, like the rest of you. I'm not a detective. I don't have answers." Poirot did not press him further. Instead, he turned his attention to the final two men, Julian Beckett and Thomas Webber, who had remained eerily silent throughout the questioning. Both looked to be on edge, but neither had volunteered much in the way of useful information. Poirot's sharp mind was already working through the possibilities, piecing together the subtle clues like a master at a chessboard. There was something behind Leclerc's sudden bet, his reckless wager, and his calculated move that night. Something hidden, something dark. But the key to solving this, Poirot knew, lay in understanding Leclerc's past, his debts, his strained relationships with other wealthy individuals, the whispered rumors of shady dealings and underhanded business practices. All of it held a piece of the puzzle. And somewhere in the midst of it all, there was a thread that would lead to the truth. But where? Poirot's gaze lingered on each of the players as they stood there, their faces masks of innocence or guilt. The game, it seemed, was far from over. "This is no simple murder," Poirot murmured. "It is a mystery that reaches beyond this room. The past of Monsieur Leclerc. That is where we must begin." The room seemed to grow colder as I absorbed his words. Leclerc's secrets were still locked away, but they would soon be revealed. And when they were, Poirot would have the answers. But which secret would be the one that led us to the killer? Chapter 4. The gamblers past Poirot's investigation had only just begun to scratch the surface of the mystery, but already the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to shift in ways that suggested a much more intricate web than a simple murder. The subtle mark on Leclerc's neck, the strange behavior of the guests, and the cryptic clues that lay scattered like breadcrumbs all pointed toward a deeper story. But what was it? And who among the guests had a motive to kill the wealthy gambler? As Poirot paced around the drawing room, his mind worked furiously, tracing the threads of the mystery back through time. He turned to me, his usual calm demeanor betraying a hint of urgency. "Hastings, we must understand more of Monsieur Leclerc's past. It is there, I suspect, that we shall find the key to unlocking this crime." We wasted no time. The sprawling estate of the Ashford family provided ample resources to dig into Leclerc's history. His financial records, social ties, and personal correspondences were all meticulously examined. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became that Leclerc's life had been one of high stakes, a gambler's world where every move was calculated, but, as the years went on, increasingly reckless. "He was once a man of great fortune," Poirot said as we sat in the library, sifting through a mountain of papers. "A gambler of exceptional skill, but his downfall began some years ago when his fortunes took a sharp turn downward. His enemies, real or imagined, grew, and soon he became obsessed with the idea of regaining his lost glory." "Seems he bet everything," I remarked, flipping through a ledger that showed significant debts accumulated over the last few months. "But he wasn't just losing at cards, he was losing his mind." Poirot nodded gravely. Indeed. You see, Hastings, gamblers are not like ordinary men. There is an addiction to control, to dominance. Monsieur Leclerc sought not only to win, but to master the game, to be the one pulling the strings. But as with all addictions, once the control slips, it leads to an unrelenting spiral. That is what happened to Leclerc. He became obsessed with one anonymous opponent who, strangely enough, he never saw, only knew by name. This opponent, who had played him at every turn, seemed to know exactly how to outwit him. I frowned. Do we have a name for this opponent? Or any idea who they might be? Poirot shook his head. No name, no face, a shadow, Hastings, a shadow in Leclerc's mind and in his life. But we will find them, or at least the reason for this. There is always a reason behind the loss of control. Always. We spent the next hour sorting through papers that detailed Leclerc's various business dealings. It was clear that the once proud gambler had fallen into disreputable circles. A man who had once enjoyed lavish parties and endless victories now seemed desperate, out of sorts, as though every hand he played was a losing one. Just as I began to think we might have uncovered all there was to know, Poirot's eyes landed on something interesting, a letter yellowed with age and somewhat crumpled as though it had been hastily thrown aside. It was unsigned, but the message within was unsettling. "Ah," Poirot murmured as he read aloud. "You're about to lose, Monsieur Leclerc. The bet is already made, the cards already dealt. You have no choice but to fall." I blinked in confusion. What does it mean, Poirot? Who could have written this? Poirot's face was unreadable. It seems to confirm something we've suspected, mon ami. Leclerc's losses were not mere accidents. Someone had been manipulating him. This anonymous opponent, whoever they were, knew exactly when to strike. And it is no coincidence that Leclerc's death occurred right after he made a desperate, reckless bet. I sat back, absorbing the weight of Poirot's words. This letter was like a key that had just unlocked a part of the mystery, but there were still so many unanswered questions. Who was behind the anonymous opponent? And why now, after all this time, had Leclerc been killed? Poirot's expression softened as he folded the letter with care. It is not just about the game, Hastings. It is about the game of life. Leclerc was a man who needed to win, needed to control his own fate. But in the end, he was nothing more than a puppet in someone else's hands. I could see the gears turning in Poirot's mind as he pieced together the final threads. "But who?" I asked, leaning forward. "Who could have orchestrated this? Who had the most to gain?" Poirot remained silent for a moment, deep in thought. Finally, he turned to me, his gaze sharp. "The answer, Hastings, lies not just in who had the means, but who had the opportunity. There were many who might have benefited from Leclerc's death. But one person stands out more than the others. Lady Evelyn." My eyes widened. "Lady Evelyn? Surely not." Poirot's gaze was unwavering. "You see, Hastings, it is often the most unlikely suspect who harbours the deepest secrets. Lady Evelyn had more than just a passing connection to Leclerc. Her demeanour, her anxiety when questioned, it was all too telling. She is hiding something. Perhaps not directly involved in the murder, but perhaps complicit in some way. The games she played were not merely with cards." "But what would her motive be?" I asked, my mind racing. Poirot held up a finger, signalling for silence. "Ah, mon ami, you are forgetting one crucial detail. Lady Evelyn has a history of financial troubles. You saw it yourself in the ledger. And what better way to remove a man like Leclerc, who held power over her fortunes, than to force him into a losing position where his death would seem like a mere consequence of his addiction?" I was beginning to see the picture come together, but a nagging feeling still lingered in the back of my mind. Lady Evelyn, while suspicious, didn't quite fit the mould of a cold-blooded murderer. Was there something more to her involvement that Poirot was not yet revealing? Before I could voice my concerns, Poirot raised a hand. "Not so fast, Hastings. Let us not jump to conclusions. There are more layers to this mystery than we have yet uncovered. Perhaps Lady Evelyn had assistance. Perhaps she was not acting alone." I turned to him, my curiosity piqued. "You mean—" Poirot's lips curled into a wry smile. "Let us not be blinded by beauty or charm. Hastings, one must always be cautious in the game of appearances. There are many players at this table, and each one has their own hand to play." The weight of his words hung in the air as we both turned back to the papers before us, the mystery of Leclerc's death growing ever more tangled. I could feel the tension building, the subtle intricacies of the game pulling us deeper into its web. Poirot stood up and turned toward the door. "We must confront Lady Evelyn once again, Hastings, but this time we must ask the right questions, and we must be prepared for the answers that lie just beyond the surface." The door closed behind him, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Was Lady Evelyn truly the key to this whole affair, or was she just another pawn in a much more elaborate game? Chapter 5. False leads and growing tensions. The quiet of the library was a stark contrast to the tension that had been building all afternoon. With the discovery of the letter, the investigation had taken a new turn, and I could see that Poirot's mind was whirring, as always, methodically connecting dots that I could barely see. I had gathered all the information I could from the family members, but now it was time to turn my attention to the staff. A family's servants often know far more than they let on, and I could only imagine what secrets they might hold. First, I encountered the butler, Mr. Cartwright, a man whose impeccable uniform and stiff demeanour suggested a man who took his duties with an almost obsessive seriousness. He was in his late 50s, his grey hair neatly combed, his posture ramrod
Straight.
The moment I entered the drawing-room where we had arranged to meet, he stood promptly and motioned for me to sit. "Mr. Poirot," he said, his voice low and polite, "I trust you find everything to your satisfaction." "I have not yet had a full opportunity to explore the estate, but I find it, shall we say, most intriguing," I replied. "There is something about this place, monsieur, that suggests all is not as it seems. Now I must ask you, Mr. Cartwright, did you notice
Anything unusual in the days leading up to Mr. Hadley's death?"
He hesitated for only a moment before answering, but I noticed the slight tension in his jaw. "I have been in Mr. Hadley's service for over 30 years, Monsieur Poirot. I can honestly say that nothing out of the ordinary occurred. The master was a man of routine, of regular habits, nothing that would have given me cause to suspect anything untoward. I studied him carefully. There was something in his eyes, perhaps a flicker of something he was not willing to share. The servants often knew more than they were willing to admit, especially in a household like this one, where wealth and power mingled with secrets. And the night of Mr. Hadley's death? Were you on duty?" "I was, monsieur. But I retired early that night. I had not been feeling well, and the master was already asleep. I heard nothing unusual, and I saw nothing out of the ordinary." His answer was straightforward, perhaps too straightforward. I decided to press further, but before I could speak, he continued, "Of course, the day after the funeral it was strange. There was a great deal of talk among the staff. Mrs. Hadley seemed distraught, naturally, but she was also quite insistent that we maintain a sense of normalcy." "Did she seem particularly agitated?" I asked, narrowing my eyes slightly. Well, Cartwright paused, shifting uncomfortably. She was upset, yes, but nothing out of the ordinary for a widow. His words rang hollow, as though he were repeating a script rather than sharing his true feelings. He was hiding something. His answer was too careful. Very well, Mr. Cartwright. I appreciate your candor. If you think of anything else, anything at all, do not hesitate to inform me. I left him standing by the fire, still stiff and formal. My instincts told me there was more to his story than he was willing to share, but I had learned nothing concrete in this interview. It was time to speak with the housekeeper. Mrs. Parker was a woman in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense. When she entered the drawing-room to meet me, she carried herself with an air of authority, and there was no pretense of cordiality. She was a woman who had seen and heard much in her time. "Mr. Poirot," she greeted me briskly. "I suppose you are here to ask questions about the death of Mr. Hadley?" "Indeed, madame," I replied. "I understand you were in the household for many years. You must have witnessed the ebb and flow of family life here." "I've been here for 10 years, yes," she answered, folding her hands in front of her.
And I'll admit, it hasn't been the most peaceful of places. The Hadley family have always been a complicated lot, especially when it comes to money. Money, I mused. Yes, it often brings out the darker sides of people. Tell me.
"Mrs. Parker, did you notice anything unusual the night Mr. Hadley died, or perhaps in the days leading up to it?" She hesitated, as if measuring her words. "I didn't see anything unusual, not at first. But there was something odd about the way Mrs. Hadley acted after the funeral. She seemed distracted, as if her mind was elsewhere. It was as if she were waiting for something." "Waiting for something?" I echoed, leaning forward.
Connecting dots that I could barely see.
I felt the air grow thicker as Poirot's words sank in. The possibility that Turner had killed Leclerc over a debt, and perhaps over more than that, was growing ever more plausible. But as Poirot had warned, we could not simply focus on one, lead, and ignore the others. There were still too many questions left unanswered. We moved to the drawing-room where the guests had begun to gather for the evening, their nervous chatter filling the air. It was time to confront Turner, to ask him directly about the debts he owed Leclerc, and see how he would react. Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the room, settling on Turner, who stood near the fireplace, looking as though he were waiting for something. Perhaps a confrontation, or perhaps he was simply plotting his next move. Poirot's voice broke the silence, cool and measured. "Monsieur Turner," he said, his gaze never leaving the man's face, "I believe we need to talk about your relationship with Monsieur Leclerc. It appears you owe him quite a significant sum." Turner's eyes flickered for a moment, but only for a moment. He quickly masked his surprise with a grin, one that seemed too wide, too practiced. "Ah, Leclerc," he said, his voice smooth but tinged with bitterness. "A man who always got the better of me. I suppose it was only a matter of time before his luck ran out."
"Indeed," Poirot replied, his voice laced with an undertone of sharpness. "But what I wonder, Monsieur Turner, is whether it was you who made his luck run out. Could it be that you found yourself in need of something more than money? Perhaps something more permanent?" Turner stiffened but quickly regained his composure, offering a hollow laugh.
"What are you suggesting, Poirot? That I killed him over a few debts? Ridiculous. I had no reason to harm him. My money's my own concern." Poirot's eyes remained fixed on Turner. "Of course. But you see, Monsieur Turner, it is not just about the money, is it? There is something far deeper at play here, something personal." A shift in Turner's demeanour told Poirot all he needed to know. For just a moment the mask slipped. Turner's arrogance, his defiance, they all seemed to crack under the weight of Poirot's words. In that brief instant, Poirot saw something more. Fear. Fear of being exposed, of losing control. I stepped forward, my hand hovering near the pocket where I had concealed the gambling note. "If I may, Monsieur Turner, it seems you've been caught in quite a bind." Turner's eyes flickered to me, then quickly away. It was subtle, but enough for Poirot to catch. Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper, but there was no mistaking the deadly certainty in it. "Ah, you see, Hastings, this is the moment. The moment when a man who has been cornered must either break or stand firm. And I suspect, Monsieur Turner, that you have far more to lose than just money." Turner's face paled, and for a long moment no one spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. And then, just as I thought the confrontation would escalate, a voice interrupted us. It was Lady Evelyn, standing at the threshold of the drawing-room, her face a mask of both worry and defiance. "Poirot, I need to speak with you," she said, her voice trembling. "There's something you need to know, something that might change everything." Chapter 6. A Pattern of Deceit Lady. Evelyn stood frozen in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as though bracing herself for whatever revelation was about to come. Her voice, though trembling, was tinged with an urgent desperation. That made it clear she had been holding something back. Poirot's gaze never left her as he slowly took a step forward. "Poirot," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "There is something you need to understand. Something that may change the entire course of your investigation." I watched her carefully. The way her lips trembled, her body tense. With anticipation, it was as if she feared the weight of her own confession. And yet, Poirot did not rush her. His calm presence, his unspoken understanding of the human psyche, allowed her the space to speak at her own pace. "What is it, madame?" Poirot asked, his voice soft but firm, coaxing yet authoritative. She hesitated, glancing nervously at the others in the room, still frozen in place as they watched her, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Sir Henry's eyes darted toward Lady Evelyn, his face paling slightly at the sight of her distress. Turner, still standing by the fireplace, seemed almost indifferent, his expression unreadable, though I noticed his posture had stiffened ever so slightly. Lady Evelyn seemed to make up her mind, and with a swift, almost imperceptible motion, she reached into her handbag. Her fingers fumbled slightly as she withdrew a small, neatly folded piece of paper. The moment she handed it to Poirot, I felt the shift in the room. The tension thickened, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. Poirot took the paper without a word, his eyes scanning it quickly. As he read, I could see the subtle changes in his expression, the first flicker of surprise, the narrowing of his eyes as he processed the information, and then the faintest of smiles tugging at the corners of his lips. "Well?" Poirot said, his voice taking on a new tone, one that was both calm and matter-of-fact. "It seems, Lady Evelyn, that you and Monsieur Leclerc were closer than we have been led to believe." She flinched, her hand rising instinctively to her mouth as if trying to stop the words that Poirot had just spoken from being heard. But there was no denying the truth that hung in the air now. I didn't want anyone to know," she began, her voice faltering. "I thought if I kept it buried, if no one ever found out about that debt, it wouldn't matter. but I never intended for him to be dead, Poirot interjected smoothly, his words cutting through her panic with surgical precision. Yes, I understand, Madame. But the fact remains you owed him a considerable sum, a sum that I suspect was more than just a simple gambling debt. She looked down at her hands, twisting them together as if trying to hide the truth from herself. It wasn't just about money, she confessed finally, her voice low. Leclerc knew things about me, about my past, things that no one could ever find out. Poirot's eyes were intense now, his gaze piercing. Things you would do anything
to keep hidden. She nodded slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line as if sealing off whatever secret had been uncovered by that letter.
But Poirot wasn't finished. His methodical mind was already working, piecing together the information he had so far. Tell me, Madame, Poirot continued, his voice almost too quiet. What was the nature of your relationship with Monsieur Leclerc? Was it simply business? Or was there something more personal? She swallowed hard, her face growing paler with every passing second. I'm not proud of it, but yes, it was personal. He was going to use the information he had to ruin me, Poirot. I was desperate to keep my reputation intact. You have to understand I had no choice. I saw Poirot's gaze flicker briefly toward Sir Henry, whose expression had hardened in the wake of Lady Evelyn's confession. It was clear that he was struggling with the implications of her words, his earlier agitation now replaced by something darker. Perhaps guilt, perhaps fear. But Poirot was already turning his attention back to Lady Evelyn. Perhaps, Madame, Poirot said, his voice taking on a more thoughtful tone. It was not just the debt that led to Leclerc's death. Perhaps it was the fear of him revealing what he knew. Lady Evelyn's eyes widened slightly, and she nodded again, slowly. Yes, Poirot, he was going to expose me. I knew he would. He wasn't the type to keep quiet about something like that. Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile, though it was devoid of any warmth. And you, Lady Evelyn, were quite determined to keep your secret. But there were others who were also desperate, I suspect, others who wanted to see Monsieur Leclerc silenced for reasons of their own. At that, Sir Henry took a step forward, his face contorted in frustration. This is absurd! What is all this talk about secrets? I told you already. I had nothing to do with it. I didn't know about any of this. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the strain he was under. Poirot's eyes remained fixed on him, unblinking. You are nervous, Sir Henry. A man who has nothing to hide is rarely so anxious, so defensive. Sir Henry's face reddened, his fists clenching at his sides. I've already told you, Poirot, I had nothing to do with it. I didn't even know Leclerc was involved with Lady Evelyn. If you think... Poirot raised a hand to silence him, his expression calm but firm. It is not just about what you knew, Sir Henry, but about what you did not know. And that, I suspect, is where the true motive lies. I could see the pieces of the puzzle falling into place in Poirot's mind. There was more at play here than simple debts and secrets. There was a pattern, a web of relationships that were intricately connected, and at the centre of it all was Leclerc, a man who had known far too much about far too many people. Poirot turned his attention back to Lady Evelyn, who had visibly stiffened at Sir Henry's outburst. Madame, he said, his voice now even softer. This letter you've given me, it speaks of a debt, but I wonder, was there more? Was there someone else who had something to gain from Leclerc's death? Lady Evelyn's eyes darted to Sir Henry, then to Turner, who still stood silent in the corner of the room, watching the exchange with a strange intensity. For the first time, I saw a flicker of realization cross her face, as if she were beginning to understand the implications of her own words. Poirot's eyes glinted.
Ah, yes, you see, it is not simply a question of who killed Leclerc, but why. And I believe, madame, that the answer lies not only in your own fears, but in the actions of others, the ones pulling the strings from the shadows. There was
A long pause, the silence in the room thick with tension. As Lady Evelyn's confession hung in the air, I could sense the turning of the tide. The case was becoming more complicated by the minute, and yet I had the distinct feeling that we were nearing a breakthrough. Just then, a soft sound interrupted the moment. A faint tapping at the door. Poirot's gaze shifted toward the sound, and I saw the slightest narrowing of his eyes. "Come in," he said, his voice carrying an unspoken warning. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room, someone I had not expected to see. It was the butler, his face pale, his
eyes wide with fear. "Poirot," he said, in a trembling voice, "you need to see this. There's been another development."
Chapter 7. The Unmasking of Secret. The butler's words hung in the air, heavy with promise and foreboding. We had been suspended in a delicate moment, with Lady Evelyn's confession still fresh, and Sir Henry's defensive posture betraying
more than he might have liked. And yet now the butler had interrupted us with his sudden arrival, his pallor suggesting something far worse than an ordinary interruption. Poirot, ever the master of maintaining his composure, turned his sharp
gaze toward the man, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Speak, my friend," Poirot said, his voice low but commanding. "What is this development?" The butler cleared his throat, his hands visibly trembling, as he held out a small brown envelope. "It's from the archives, Monsieur Poirot. I found it when I was going through some old records. It's
about Sir Henry." Poirot took the envelope, his fingers brushing the edges delicately. There was no haste in his movements, but his mind was already churning, considering the possibilities.
He glanced at Sir Henry, whose face had grown even paler at the butler's words. "Something about Sir Henry, you say?" Poirot's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable tension under the surface, one that seemed to echo in the room, as everyone, even Lady Evelyn, leaned forward, waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. The butler nodded nervously. "I'm not sure what it means, sir, but I thought you should see it." Poirot carefully slit the envelope open with a small letter opener, the rustling of the paper too loud in the otherwise silent room. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age, its edges slightly frayed. It was a journal entry, one written in Sir Henry's hand. Poirot scanned the words quickly, his brow furrowing as he absorbed the details. "It appears," Poirot began, his voice deliberate, "that Sir Henry had a very particular interest in Monsieur Leclerc's affairs, a fascination that bordered
on obsession." Sir Henry flinched, his hands tightening into fists at his sides, though he said nothing. I could see his jaw working, but the words were stuck in his throat.
It was as if the weight of the journal entry had thrown him off balance. Something in the writing had struck too close to the truth. "What does it say, Poirot?" Lady Evelyn asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "What is this about?" Poirot's gaze was fixed on the paper, his mind piecing together the implications of what he had just read. It appears that Sir Henry had been following Leclerc's every move for quite some time. A detailed record of Leclerc's rise, his success, his partnerships, his every deal. It's as if Sir Henry saw him not just as a rival, but as someone to be surpassed. There is even mention of a certain desire to eliminate Leclerc as a threat. At this, Sir Henry's face darkened, his shoulders stiffening in a way that spoke volumes. Lady Evelyn's eyes darted between him and Poirot.
"Clearly on edge. I have no idea what you're talking about," Sir Henry said finally, his voice hoarse. "That's absurd. A record of what? Of my jealousy? Of my what? Of my murder of Leclerc?" Poirot raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture. "Calm yourself, Sir Henry. I am not suggesting anything just yet, but this journal tells a
Story. A story of an obsession with a man who was, perhaps, too successful for your liking." Sir Henry's lips curled into a sneer, but the underlying anger was palpable. "You have no idea what you're implying, Poirot. This is all nonsense. What does this have to do with Leclerc's death?" Poirot's eyes flickered back to the paper, his gaze sharp and discerning. "There is something more at play here. This obsession, it is not just about rivalry. No, it is something deeper. A need, perhaps, to control, to prove oneself superior." I could see the wheels turning in Poirot's mind. He wasn't finished yet. He turned the page of the journal, his eyes scanning for any further detail that could unlock the mystery. Then something caught his attention, a set of photographs tucked into the folds of the journal's back pages. They were faded and yellowing with age, but the figures within them were unmistakable. Lady Evelyn and Sir Henry, in intimate settings. The photographs were taken in private moments, moments that revealed far more than either of them would have liked. The room grew still, the silence pressing in from all sides. Sir Henry's face, contorted in disbelief, his eyes darting from the photographs to Poirot, his hands trembling now. You're going to bring that up now?" Sir Henry spat, his voice raw with emotion. Those were nothing, just old memories. You're grasping at straws, Poirot. This means nothing." Poirot's gaze remained fixed on Sir Henry, unwavering. "Does it not, Sir
"Henry, does it not suggest something more personal between you and Lady Evelyn?" Lady Evelyn's face had gone a shade paler, her eyes avoiding Sir Henry's gaze, and I caught the flicker of something, a moment of guilt, perhaps, crossing her face.
It was fleeting, but it was there. Poirot leaned forward, his voice quiet, but filled with the weight of his observation. "You both had something to lose, did you not? Sir Henry, you resented Leclerc's success, while Lady Evelyn, well, you were not exactly free of your own debts. How convenient it would have been to remove him from the equation." The words hung in the air like a taut string waiting to snap. Lady Evelyn took a sharp breath, her eyes wide now, as if she were being forced into a corner she could not escape from. "You think we had something to do with his death, Poirot?" she asked, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Is that what you're suggesting?" Poirot nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I suggest that there is more to this story than meets the eye. A deadly combination of jealousy, greed, and fear, all intertwined. But there is something else, something darker at play." I watched Poirot closely, knowing that his mind was already racing ahead, drawing connections no one else could see. His theory, though compelling, felt incomplete. There was something off about it. His eyes flicked toward Turner, who had remained eerily silent throughout the exchange. Turner's expression had not shifted since he'd entered the room, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, spoke volumes. His silence was too deliberate. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ah, yes, Mr. Turner, you've been rather quiet, haven't you? Perhaps you have some insight into these photographs."
"After all, you were a close friend of Leclerc, were you not?"
Turner stiffened, his gaze briefly flickering to Sir Henry and Lady Evelyn before settling back on Poirot. He shifted on his feet, his jaw tight. "Why don't you leave me out of this?" Turner said, his voice clipped, his lips curling into a thin, insincere smile. "I have no part in any of this." Poirot's eyes flashed with a knowing glint. "I wonder, Mr. Turner, how much you know about what really happened the night Leclerc died. You, who had so much to lose if he ever found out about your little arrangement with him. You, who needed him out of the way." Turner's smile faltered slightly, his eyes flickering with a brief, almost imperceptible flash of fear. It was enough to make Poirot press further, but before he could speak again, there was a sharp knock at the door. The butler entered, holding another letter. This, one stamped with an official seal. He handed it to Poirot, his expression grave. Poirot's eyes scanned the envelope, his hand pausing mid-motion. "Ah, this is from the authorities, I presume? How interesting." A cold sense of dread seemed to settle over the room as Poirot
tore open the letter. Whatever it said, I had the feeling that the investigation was about to take an even darker turn.
Chapter 8. A web of lies. Poirot did not immediately speak as he held the letter, his eyes scanning its contents with the quiet precision I had come to expect. The air in the room had thickened, charged with tension, as though the walls themselves were closing in around us. Lady Evelyn, her face still pale from the confrontation, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Sir Henry, his face a mask of barely contained frustration, seemed to be mentally calculating his next move. Turner stood by the window, his back to the group, his arms folded across his chest, as if to shield himself from the scrutiny of Poirot's gaze. The letter, which had been handed to Poirot by the butler, was brief, its contents enigmatic but clearly significant. It was from the local authorities requesting Poirot's immediate attention regarding an aspect of the investigation he had not yet fully explored. The note mentioned a ledger, a financial record linked to the very heart of Leclerc's dealings, which the authorities had recently uncovered in the course of their investigation. It was a document that had slipped under Poirot's radar until now. Poirot folded the letter with deliberate care, his fingers tracing the edges as though absorbing the weight of the discovery. This is a development," he murmured, softly, almost to himself, but the words rang with the unmistakable promise of a breakthrough. "A ledger, a hidden ledger containing financial transactions of great importance." Lady Evelyn's gaze flicked nervously between Poirot and Sir
Henry. "What does it mean, Poirot?"
she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does this ledger have to do with Leclerc's murder?" Poirot's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, his eyes glimmering with that sharp, all-knowing light that had become so familiar to me. "It means that the ties that bind you all to Monsieur Leclerc are far more tangled than I initially believed. Financial dealings, debts, and perhaps motives hidden beneath the surface." Turner, who had been unusually quiet, shifted uncomfortably at the mention of the ledger. His face remained carefully neutral, but his body language betrayed his discomfort. His fingers clenched tightly around his arms, and his posture stiffened as if preparing for something unpleasant. Poirot noticed the subtle shift instantly. "I believe," Poirot continued, his voice calm but filled with purpose, "it is time we had another discussion with Mr. Turner." He turned toward the man by the window, his gaze fixed on him. "Mr. Turner, I would appreciate it if you would share your thoughts on this ledger." Turner's face hardened, his jaw tightening in a way that suggested he was bracing for impact. "I don't know anything about any ledger," he said, his voice low and controlled, though I could detect the underlying strain. "I've told
You everything I know about Leclerc. You don't need to drag me into your suspicions." Poirot regarded him with quiet intensity, his eyes scanning Turner's face, reading the micro-expressions that most people would have missed.
"You seem troubled, Mr. Turner," Poirot said softly. "Tell me, is it the mention of a ledger that unsettles you? Or perhaps the idea that your dealings with Leclerc are being brought to light?" Turner's response was swift and harsh, his voice rising in agitation.
"I told you, Poirot, I have no idea what you're talking about." He stepped away from the window, his movements sharp and defensive. "This is ridiculous. You can't just throw accusations around without proof." Poirot's gaze didn't
Waver. "Ah, but there is proof, Mr. Turner. A ledger, a record of transactions between you and Leclerc, hidden in plain sight." Poirot paused, letting the words sink in, and then added with deliberate emphasis, "Do you care to explain the—"
nature of those transactions? For a moment, Turner seemed to falter.
His eyes flickered nervously, and his posture slackened for just the briefest of moments, a telltale sign that he was struggling to maintain control. Then, with a deep breath, he forced himself back into a semblance of composure. "I don't."
"Know what's in that ledger?" Turner said, his voice cool but brittle. "If there's anything, it's purely business. Leclerc and I had an arrangement, a professional one, nothing more. I was a consultant, nothing more."
Poirot raised an eyebrow, his voice dipping lower as he spoke. "A consultant? Is that all? You wouldn't be hiding any debts in those transactions, would you, Mr. Turner? Debts that might have caused you distress?" At the mention of debts, I saw Turner's composure crack, just slightly, but enough to confirm my suspicions. His mouth tightened, and his hands curled into fists at his sides, betraying an unspoken panic. He took a few steps backward, as if distancing himself from the accusations. "I'm not some common debtor, Poirot," he spat. "I don't owe anyone anything." Poirot did not relent. "Perhaps not. But the need to win, Mr. Turner, your compulsive drive to come out on top, to succeed at all costs, has a price, does it not?" He paused for a moment, his gaze piercing. "What would you do to keep your position, your reputation? What would you be willing to sacrifice?" Turner's face twisted with a mix of frustration and something darker, something much more dangerous.
"You have no idea what it's like, Poirot. You don't know what it means to fight for every scrap of success.
To claw your way to the top, only to be held back by people who don't understand. Leclerc didn't understand that. He thought he could just steamroll anyone in his path." His voice cracked, and for the first time I saw the raw edge of his emotion. "I had to keep him in line, Poirot. I had no choice." Poirot's eyes never left Turner's face as he absorbed this confession. "No choice?" Poirot echoed, his tone reflecting a quiet sympathy. "Ah, but Mr. Turner, you always—"
"Have a choice."
"And yet, here you stand, trapped by your own obsession, a need to win, a need to be superior." Turner's breathing grew ragged, and for a brief moment I saw him teeter on the edge of self-destruction. His tightly controlled exterior was beginning to crumble, revealing the cracks in his carefully constructed persona. "Enough." Sir Henry's voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. "This is nonsense. We're not here to discuss Mr. Turner's issues. We need to focus on the facts." Poirot turned his gaze toward Sir Henry, his expression unreadable. "Ah, Sir Henry, you are most concerned with facts, are you not? Perhaps you should be concerned with the people behind them, for they are the ones who shape those facts." Lady Evelyn, who had been silently observing the exchange, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I think we're all starting to lose sight of the truth here, she said, her voice faltering. There's so much suspicion, so much blame, but what do we really know? Poirot smiled, but it was a small, tight smile, one that carried the weight of someone who had already drawn his conclusions. We know much, madame, but the question is not what we know. It is what we do with what we know. Turning back to Turner, Poirot's next words were deliberate and calculated. Mr. Turner, you may be more involved in this than you care to admit. You had a debt, a hidden debt, and Leclerc. He was in a position to use that against you. That, I believe, was your greatest fear. Poirot's eyes flicked to the others in the room. And the others? They had their reasons too. Greed, jealousy. But the question remains. Who stood to gain the most from Leclerc's demise? I could see the puzzle pieces coming together, though there was still one final piece missing. The truth was close, so very close, but the last thread remained elusive, slipping just out of reach. As Poirot stood silently for a moment, the weight of his words lingering in the room, I knew the investigation was nearing its conclusion. But there was one thing I was certain of. The final revelation would come from someone who had yet to speak the truth. Chapter 9. More clues, more questions. The room was heavy with tension as we gathered again, the air thick with unanswered questions. Poirot, as always, was the calm in the storm, his mind working tirelessly, his eyes focused and intent on piecing together the puzzle that had been laid before him. Sir Henry, who had been somewhat subdued since his earlier confrontation, sat stiffly in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. Lady Evelyn, ever the picture of grace, sat across from him, her gaze flickering between Poirot and her husband with an air of barely contained concern. Turner, who had been a source of much of the agitation earlier, now stood near the window, his posture rigid, his eyes distant, as though he was trying to will himself out of the uncomfortable situation. Poirot's piercing gaze swept the room, but his attention lingered on Sir Henry for a moment longer than necessary. The man had been tight-lipped, evasive, and Poirot's instincts told him that there was far more to Sir Henry's involvement than he had let on. "You know, Sir Henry," Poirot said in his soft, measured tone, "I find myself wondering about something. We have discussed your business dealings, your associations with Monsieur Leclerc, and yet there is something I have yet to understand fully." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "Tell me, Sir Henry, how involved were you in the other
activities of Monsieur Leclerc, not just the financial arrangements, but the, shall we say, more secretive ones?"
Sir Henry's eyes narrowed, his fingers stilling their nervous tapping. He straightened, as though bracing for the full force of Poirot's scrutiny. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice cool but laced with a tension that Poirot was quick to recognize. Poirot's lips curled upward in that characteristic smile of his, but it was a smile that never reached his eyes. "Ah, but you do, Sir Henry. You see, I have discovered something that might change our understanding of Monsieur Leclerc's financial dealings, something that hints at a much more complicated web than we previously considered." He paused, his gaze sharpening. "An envelope, Sir Henry. An envelope found in your office." Sir Henry's face stiffened, but he did not speak. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his voice low and deliberate. "Inside that envelope, Sir Henry, were betting
slips.
Not for card games, as you might expect, but for several hidden matches that involved large sums of money, and some less than reputable individuals. What can you tell me about that, Sir Henry? Why would Monsieur Leclerc be involved?"
In such activities. For a moment, Sir Henry was silent, his eyes flicking to Lady Evelyn before quickly looking away. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, betraying his growing unease. He cleared his throat, his posture stiffening. "I don't
Know what you're talking about, Poirot. I don't gamble, and I certainly don't involve myself with the kind of people you're suggesting." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his expression a mixture of amusement and disbelief. "Really, Sir Henry? Then perhaps you would care to explain why your name appears on these slips along with the names of several other prominent figures. Is it just a coincidence that these matches were tied to the same individuals who were involved with Leclerc?" The silence that followed was palpable. Sir Henry's eyes darted nervously as he struggled to find a way out of the situation.
I don't know what to say. I told you I have no involvement in any of this. If you want to accuse me of something, then go ahead. But you're wrong, Poirot. I had nothing to do with Leclerc's murder." Poirot studied him closely.
His eyes narrowing. "No, Sir Henry, I do not accuse you yet, but the evidence speaks for itself, does it not?" He paused, letting the words hang in the air for a moment. These betting slips suggest something far more intricate than a personal betrayal. There is something bigger at play here, something more sinister. Perhaps the murder was not just
About jealousy or revenge. Perhaps it was about money. Sir Henry shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering toward Lady Evelyn once more. "Money?" he asked, his voice strained. "What do you mean?"
Poirot's gaze softened slightly, though his tone remained sharp. "I mean that this is no longer a simple case of personal animosities. The stakes, Sir Henry, are much higher than that. Leclerc, it seems, was involved in a much larger financial scheme, one that extended beyond the world of high society and card games. This was about gambling, yes, but it was also about control, power, and people would kill for those things, would they not?" Lady Evelyn, who had been silent throughout the exchange, now spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "You're saying that someone killed Leclerc over a gambling debt?" she asked, her eyes wide with disbelief. "But that doesn't make sense. Leclerc had money. He didn't need to resort to such measures." Poirot shook his head, his fingers steepled in front of his face as he leaned back in his chair. "Ah, but money can be a powerful motivator, madame. Even someone like Leclerc, who appeared to be at the height of his success, could have found himself entangled in something far darker than anyone realized. People who seek power do not always play by the rules, and they often leave behind a trail of destruction." His eyes turned back to Sir Henry, who was now visibly sweating, his hands shaking ever so slightly. "You are, of course, familiar with the nature of these transactions, Sir Henry. You understand how dangerous they can be. You see, when the stakes get this high, when the players are this powerful, one wrong move, one misstep, and everything can come crashing down." Sir Henry opened his mouth to respond, but the words faltered on his lips, as though he had been caught in the very web he had tried to weave around others. Poirot's voice, soft yet filled with certainty, broke the silence. "I believe, sir, Henry, that you and Leclerc were not just business associates. No, you were involved in something far more precarious, and it was this involvement, this hidden alliance, that may have ultimately cost Leclerc his life." The room was still as death, the weight of Poirot's words sinking in. Lady Evelyn's gaze flickered from her husband to Poirot, her face pale, her lips trembling. Sir Henry, however, seemed to shrink under the weight of the accusation, his earlier bravado melting away like snow in the sun. I don't know what you're talking about," Sir Henry said, his voice trembling now.
"I didn't stop," Poirot interrupted, his voice a quiet command. "We are not interested in your denials, Sir Henry. The evidence speaks for itself. What I want to know now is this. Who else knew about Leclerc's involvement in these illegal activities? Who else stood to lose if the truth came out? Sir Henry's face drained of colour as he swallowed hard.
The silence that followed was deafening, the truth hanging just out of reach, like a fruit ripe for the picking. Lady Evelyn, still reeling from the turn of events, looked to Poirot with a mixture of confusion and fear. "Is it possible?" she
asked quietly. Could this all really be about money and power? Poirot's eyes met hers, his gaze steady and thoughtful. Ah, madame, everything is about money and power. And now we must find out just how far this conspiracy reaches.
Just then there was a faint knock at the door, and the butler entered, holding a small envelope. He handed it to Poirot, his face expressionless. Poirot opened the envelope and quickly scanned the contents, his face revealing nothing. "Gentlemen, madame," Poirot said, standing up, his demeanour calm but firm, "it seems the plot thickens, and I believe we are very close to uncovering the truth." The silence in the room grew heavier, and I could feel the tension mounting. Everything was leading to one inevitable conclusion, and soon Poirot would reveal it all. But until then, the mystery remained, an enigma that had yet to be fully solved. Chapter 10. The Heart of the Mystery. The silence in the room was thick with anticipation, a weight pressing down on each of us. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the envelope he had just received, its contents still hidden from view. He held it delicately, as though it might shatter at the slightest touch. His mind, ever analytical, was already working through the possibilities, the threads of the investigation weaving together into a pattern that was, as yet, only partially revealed. The butler, standing in the doorway, seemed to sense the tension, and, after a brief moment, quietly retreated, leaving us alone with our thoughts. Sir Henry had resumed his nervous tapping on the armrest of his chair, his earlier defiance, now replaced with an uneasy, almost desperate air. Lady Evelyn, on the other hand, was pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on Poirot, as if she were waiting for him to deliver the final blow that would shatter everything they had known. Poirot's eyes flickered briefly to Sir Henry, before turning his attention to the envelope once more. He didn't open it immediately, as though giving the moment its due weight. Then at last he slid the paper from its confines, reading the contents with the calm precision that was characteristic of him. "Uh-huh," Poirot murmured, more to himself than to anyone in the room. His voice, though quiet, held an undeniable note of satisfaction. "This is interesting, very interesting indeed." Sir Henry's eyes flickered to the envelope, then quickly away. "What is it, Poirot? What have you found?" he asked, his voice strained. Poirot held up a hand, signalling for silence, as he carefully folded the paper and placed it on the desk before him. "Patience, my friend, all in good time." Turning his attention back to the gathered group, Poirot's sharp gaze seemed to pierce through the walls of suspicion and deceit, his mind already racing through the implications of the new information. He didn't share it immediately, but allowed the tension to build, savouring the suspense that hung in the air. "I believe," Poirot said at last, his voice taking on a softer, more contemplative tone, "that we are not dealing with a simple
Murder? No, this is something more elaborate, something far more devious." His eyes flicked briefly to Lady Evelyn, whose face had tightened at his words.
"I suspect, madame, that Monsieur Leclerc's death was not an accident of passion, but the culmination of a carefully constructed plan, one that went beyond mere personal grievances." Lady Evelyn's lips parted, but she did not speak. Her eyes were wide, as though the realization was slowly sinking in. Sir Henry, however, seemed to bristle at Poirot's words, his posture stiffening as he cleared his throat. "I don't understand. Are you suggesting someone planned his death for what reason?" Sir Henry asked, his voice betraying the first signs of real fear. Poirot's gaze never wavered. "Ah, you see, Sir Henry, that is the question we must now answer. Why? And more importantly, who would benefit from the murder of Leclerc? Who stood to gain from his downfall?" Poirot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his face. "You see, the gambling, it was not as it seemed, monsieur. Leclerc's losing bets, these bets which were purportedly in his favour, this, I believe, was no accident." Sir Henry's brow furrowed. "But I thought you already discovered that he had been involved in a string of losing games." "Nothing
unusual about that, surely?"
Poirot smiled thinly. "Nothing unusual, perhaps, except for the manner in which they were lost. You see, Sir Henry, I believe these losing bets were part of a much larger strategy. They were, in fact, carefully orchestrated. Leclerc was not simply unfortunate in his dealings, he was sabotaging others." The revelation hung in the air like a cloud, and for a moment none of us spoke. Poirot's words were chilling in their implication. The notion that Leclerc had not been a victim of the game, but rather a perpetrator in a larger con, turned the entire investigation on its head. "Sabotaging others?" Lady Evelyn echoed, her voice trembling slightly. "But how? And why?" Poirot's eyes gleamed as he leaned forward, eager to explain. "I have discovered evidence that Monsieur Leclerc had been manipulating the bets in such a way as to ensure that others lost. These were not games of chance, madam. They were games of control. He would allow certain individuals to believe they were winning, only to pull the rug out from under them at the last moment. And with each loss, each ruined gambler, Leclerc moved one step closer to achieving his true goal." Sir Henry's face drained of colour, and for the first time he seemed at a loss for words. Lady Evelyn glanced at him, her expression one of confusion and dawning horror. "Are you saying," Lady Evelyn asked carefully, "that Leclerc was setting people up to fail in order to ruin them?" Poirot nodded slowly. "Precisely. Leclerc was a man who needed to win at all costs, and when he couldn't achieve that victory through his usual means, he resorted to something far more insidious. By creating a network of ruined men, people who were left desperate and broken, he could manipulate them, control them, and use them for his own advantage." "But," Sir Henry interjected, his voice tinged with disbelief, "how does this
fit into his death? If he was so clever, so controlling, why would anyone kill him?" Poirot's gaze softened ever so slightly, but his mind was still racing. "Ah, that, Sir Henry, is the crux of the matter. You see, Leclerc may have been
clever, but even the most brilliant minds make mistakes. And sometimes when you play with people's lives, you gamble with more than just money. You gamble with their futures, their pride, their very existence. And when the stakes are this high, someone is bound to snap." Poirot paused, letting his words settle. "I believe that Leclerc's death was not simply a reaction to his personal vendettas. It was the result of a much larger con, a scheme that had been set in motion long before his murder."
"And whoever killed him, they had a reason that goes beyond mere jealousy. It was about power, control, and revenge." Lady Evelyn's voice shook as she spoke again, her words barely a whisper. "But who, Poirot? Who had the most to lose from this game he was playing?"
Poirot's eyes sparkled with a sudden clarity, as if the final pieces of the puzzle had clicked into place. I believe, madam, that the answer lies not in what Monsieur Leclerc stood to gain, but in what others stood to lose. He paused, his gaze shifting to Sir Henry. And I believe, Sir Henry, that you are far more involved in this than you have let on. For a brief moment, Sir Henry's eyes flickered with something, fear, guilt, or perhaps a combination of both. Poirot's words had struck a nerve, and it was clear that the final confrontation was drawing near. "There is much more at play here, I think," Poirot continued, his voice steady and filled with quiet authority. "And soon all will be revealed." The room was still as death, the weight of Poirot's revelation hanging heavily in the air. As the clock ticked away the seconds, it seemed as though time itself had come to a standstill, and all that remained was the search for the truth. Chapter 11. A final twist. The tension in the room had reached its zenith. Poirot's revelations, one after another, had brought us closer to the truth, but there was still something elusive, something just out of reach. His keen eyes, ever sharp, remained fixed on Sir Henry, who was now visibly sweating. Despite his best efforts to maintain an air of composure, his hands trembled slightly as they clasped together in his lap. Poirot, however, did not allow the moment to linger. His mind was still racing, piecing together the fragments of evidence that had been slowly unearthed. The web of deceit had grown more complex with each passing hour, and yet a nagging sensation persisted, one that told Poirot that the true motive behind Leclerc's murder remained hidden beneath layers of obfuscation. The door to the room creaked open, and the butler entered with a quiet cough, breaking the tense silence. He held a letter in his hand, his usual composure unshaken. "Mr. Poirot, there's something you might want to see. I found it in the library, tucked away in the back of the drawer." Poirot accepted the letter without a word, his attention flicking to the butler for just a moment before he turned his gaze back to the letter. His fingers carefully opened it, revealing a single, hastily written note. "I will meet you tonight. The plan is in motion, but we need to act fast. If Turner gets wind of it, all is lost." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he read the note again, his mind already working through the implications. The name Turner stood out like a beacon in Ind. The fog and the urgency in the message struck him. There was something far bigger at play here than a mere gambling scandal, and Leclerc had been at the heart of it. Poirot stood suddenly, the letter held firmly in his hand. "This, mes amis," he said, his voice steady, "changes everything." Lady Evelyn and Sir Henry exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions betraying their confusion. "I don't understand," Lady Evelyn said, her voice a mixture of frustration and fear. "What does this mean, Poirot? What is this plan you're talking about?" Poirot's eyes flicked to Sir Henry, then back to Lady Evelyn, and for a moment his expression softened. "Madame, I believe Monsieur Leclerc was not simply gambling.
No, he was playing a much more dangerous game, one that involved people far more powerful than we have yet realized. And that, I believe, is what led to his death." Sir Henry's face paled at these words. But the letters, the betting slips,
They were nothing more than games of chance, weren't they? Leclerc wasn't part of any larger conspiracy. Poirot looked at him sharply. "Ah, but that is where you are mistaken, Sir Henry. You see, these were not mere games of chance. They were strategic moves in a far larger scheme, a scheme that had been set in motion long before Leclerc's murder. The tension in the room deepened, and even Sir Henry seemed to recognize the gravity of Poirot's words. Poirot moved across, the room with a sudden, purposeful energy, his footsteps decisive as he made his way toward the door. "Come with me," he said, turning back to the others. "It is time we explore the hidden room." A few moments later, the group found themselves descending into the lower levels of the estate. The air grew colder, and the scent of old wood and dust filled the space as they followed Poirot down a narrow hallway. At the end of the corridor, a small, unmarked door stood, seemingly innocuous, but, to Poirot's eyes, filled with significance. He opened the door with a slow, deliberate motion, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves stacked high with books and papers, some of them neatly organized, others in disarray. A large, old-fashioned desk sat in the center, its surface cluttered with various items. But what caught Poirot's attention was the far wall. There, partially hidden behind a heavy curtain, was a door that seemed to have been deliberately concealed. Poirot's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "This, mes amis, is where Monsieur Leclerc met with Turner." The room, as it turned out, was far more than a simple storage space. It was a meeting room, a place where plans had been hatched and deals made in secret. As Poirot approached the hidden door, his fingers brushed against the handle. The door creaked open with a low groan, revealing a small, dimly lit space beyond. A single chair was positioned in the center of the room, and a table sat against the wall, scattered with papers and what appeared to be maps. Poirot's fingers traced the edge of a document, and he paused, reading it carefully. "Here," he murmured, holding up the paper for everyone to see. "This is it. The evidence that will reveal everything." The others gathered around, their curiosity piqued. The document, a detailed ledger of financial transactions, contained names and amounts that seemed entirely disconnected from Leclerc's gambling activities. Instead, it pointed to a far more significant and dangerous network, a conspiracy involving high-stakes betting, blackmail, and corruption on a scale that no one had anticipated. "I believe," Poirot said, his voice heavy with the weight of the revelation that Leclerc was involved in something much darker than we imagined. These bets, these were not for money alone. They were a cover for something far more insidious. Lady Evelyn's face turned white as she scanned the ledger. But this doesn't make sense. Who would he have been working with?" Poirot turned his gaze toward her, his expression grave. "I suspect that Leclerc had been operating under the direction of someone much more powerful, someone who had the means to destroy him if he refused. Turner, no doubt, was part of this larger conspiracy, but not in the way we originally thought." Sir Henry's confusion deepened. "Then who, Poirot? Who killed him?" Poirot's eyes flickered briefly to the others, and he shook his head, slowly. "None of you, I believe, were directly involved in the murder, but each of you, in your own way, is connected to the events leading up to it." Sir Henry's lips parted in disbelief. But you can't mean—" "I mean exactly that," Poirot interjected. "I have cleared all of you of suspicion. The murderer is not in this room, not yet. But the conspiracy, the true architect of Leclerc's death, that is a different matter altogether." As the last word left Poirot's lips, the door to the room slammed open with a resounding crash, and a figure stepped into the room, one that none of us had expected. The shock was palpable, and all eyes turned toward the newcomer, who had just entered the scene, ready to reveal more than any of us had anticipated. Chapter 12. The Final Showdown. The silence in the hidden room was thick, palpable, as the figure who had entered the scene stood there, framed by the doorway. The face was familiar, but the shock of their sudden appearance sent a ripple of confusion
through the group. Lady Evelyn's breath hitched, her eyes widening in disbelief. Sir Henry seemed struck dumb, his mouth opening and closing as though words had escaped him.
Even Poirot, for all his poise, paused, just for a split second, as he absorbed the identity of the newcomer. Standing there, without a hint of hesitation, was Turner. For a moment, no one spoke. Turner's presence in the room should have been impossible. At least, that's what we had all thought. He had been under investigation, and the evidence against him had seemed airtight. But here he was, very much alive, very much standing before us. He met each of our gazes with an unsettling calm, a smile playing at the edges of his lips that seemed to mock the tension that clung to the room like fog. "Good evening," Turner said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "I trust I'm not interrupting something?" Poirot's eyes narrowed, the faintest twitch of recognition crossing his features. He stood motionless for a moment longer, his hands folded in front of him in that signature pose that suggested he was processing every single detail, his mind working a mile a minute. "You have returned, Turner," Poirot said quietly. But his words carried a weight that drew everyone's attention. "You have made a grave mistake." Turner's smile didn't falter. "A mistake, Poirot?" "No, I don't think so. I believe you're the one who's mistaken. After all, it's all so simple, isn't it? The murder, the conspiracy. You've only been seeing half the picture." Poirot stepped forward, his voice unwavering, as he confronted the man who had clearly been at the center of this whole twisted affair. "It was never about the gambling, was it, Turner? It wasn't about the cards, or the stakes, or the desperate need to win. No, you have been playing a far more dangerous game, a game
of manipulation.
You used Leclerc as a pawn, and in the end you orchestrated his death." Turner's eyes gleamed, a flicker of admiration flashing across his face. "Poirot, you really do have a gift for seeing the bigger picture, don't you? But you're not wrong. It wasn't about the gambling. It was about something much more personal. You see, Leclerc had a way of getting under people's skin. He made enemies faster than he could count his winnings." Poirot's face remained unreadable. "You orchestrated this, didn't you? From the beginning. Leclerc was just a stepping stone in your plan." "Precisely," Turner said, his tone now laced with something darker, something far colder. "Leclerc thought he was playing a clever game of his own, betting on everyone, manipulating his way to the top. What he didn't realize is that there was someone watching him all along, someone who was willing to play the game better, to use him as a pawn. And in the end, he served his purpose." The room seemed to constrict with the weight of Turner's words. Lady Evelyn stepped back, her face pale, and Sir Henry's jaw tightened, as though he were struggling to understand how he had been so wrong about everything. Poirot's gaze
never wavered from Turner. "But why, Turner?" Poirot asked, his voice soft but sharp. "Why kill him? What drove you to this?"
Turner's expression flickered, just for a moment, and then it hardened. "You're right, Poirot. It was personal. You see, Leclerc had a way of betraying people, of making them feel small. He did it to me, and I was done being his fool. We had a history, one that was far more complicated than a mere gambling debt or business rivalry. Leclerc and I, we were once partners, partners in crime, if you will. But he betrayed me, stole from me, ruined everything I had worked."
I couldn't let that go. I had to make him pay." There was a shift in the room as the depth of Turner's words sunk in.
The coldness in his voice, the bitterness that coated each syllable, was unmistakable. It was a confession, though not in the traditional sense. Turner wasn't admitting to the murder in the way one might expect. No, he was admitting to something far deeper. He had been driven not just by revenge, but by a seething resentment that had festered over time. "You manipulated Leclerc from the beginning," Poirot continued, his voice steady. "You knew his weakness, and you exploited it. The betting slips, the falsified losses, it was all part of the scheme, wasn't it? A way to ruin the lives of everyone involved, to destroy them while you stayed in the shadows, pulling the strings." Turner's smile faltered for the first time, but he quickly regained his composure. "I suppose that's one way of looking
at it. But let's not get too sentimental, Poirot. This is business. In the end, Leclerc was a liability. He couldn't be trusted, and I wasn't about to let him turn on me too. He had to be removed."
Poirot's eyes flickered momentarily to Lady Evelyn and Sir Henry, who were standing at the edge of the room, their expressions a mix of horror and disbelief. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging that their suspicions had been right all along. The man they had all doubted, the one who had appeared to be the most obvious suspect, was not the killer. "It was never about Leclerc's debts or his cards," Poirot said, his voice growing more resolute. "It was about power, control, and your own twisted need for vengeance. You used the game as a smokescreen, Turner. You made everyone believe it was just a matter of bad luck or unfortunate timing." Turner's face twisted into something far darker, a look of pure malice. "People are so predictable, Poirot. They'll always take the easiest explanation. It's the same with you. You think you've got everything figured out, don't you? But there's always more to the story." Poirot stepped closer, his voice low and commanding. "The true motive was your betrayal, your sense of being wronged. It clouded your judgment, and it drove you to murder. But there's one thing you underestimated. Me." Turner's eyes flashed with something that resembled fear, and Poirot's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "You were too clever by half, Turner, too confident, and now your game is over." For a brief moment it seemed as though the tension in the room might snap. Turner's posture stiffened, his hand twitching toward his coat pocket, where, Poirot suspected, a weapon of some kind might be hidden. But before anything further could unfold, a sudden knock at the door interrupted the standoff. Poirot didn't flinch, his eyes still locked on Turner, whose hand remained poised at his side, hesitant. "Open it," Poirot said softly. The door swung open to reveal the inspector, who had been standing by outside, unaware of the full extent of the drama unfolding within. His eyes darted between Poirot, Turner, and the others in the room, confusion evident on his face. Poirot did not need to say a word. The inspector stepped forward, taking one look at Turner's guilty expression, and without hesitation placed him under arrest. And with that, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Chapter 13. The culprit revealed. The room fell into a suffocating stillness, the tension hanging in the air like a dense fog. Turner stood frozen, his expression one of disbelief as the inspector moved toward him, handcuffs already in place. Poirot, meanwhile, watched him with the cool precision of a surgeon preparing for his final cut. The others too were quiet, almost too quiet. Lady Evelyn's hands were trembling, her face pale, while Sir Henry seemed to be deep in thought, his brow furrowed, as if trying to make sense of everything that had just been revealed. Poirot's eyes shifted briefly to each of them, his lips pressing together in contemplation. He had unravelled the complicated web of lies and deception that had held them all captive, but he was far from finished. The final pieces of the puzzle still needed to fall into place. And there was something vital that had been overlooked. He could feel it, nagging at the edge of his thoughts. "Turner," Poirot said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence with an edge of finality. "You have been at the center of all of this, manipulating everyone. But there is still something you do not understand, something that even you, with all your confidence, failed to see." Turner blinked, a flicker of concern crossing his face, but he quickly masked it with a forced smirk. "What's this, Poirot? Another one of your little games?" Poirot's gaze was unyielding. "It was never just about you, Turner. It never was. You've been a pawn in a far larger game, one that has been played from the very start. Your role was always to deflect suspicion, to mislead everyone with your supposed involvement. But the true mastermind, the one who truly orchestrated this, has been right under our noses the entire time." Lady Evelyn stiffened, her eyes darting between Poirot and Turner. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Poirot's lips curled into a knowing smile. "The true murderer is someone who has been playing a far more dangerous game than any of us realized. Someone who appeared to be innocent, who stood in the shadows, watching as the rest of us stumbled through our assumptions." He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the room, before settling on one particular individual. "Sir Henry." There was a collective gasp. Sir Henry's face went ashen, his body stiffening as if he had been struck by a bolt of lightning. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Poirot held his gaze unblinking. "You," Poirot said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. "You, Sir Henry, are the one who has been behind it all." For a moment, the words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and no one dared to speak. Sir Henry's eyes flickered with a
panic, and his breath became shallow, his chest rising and falling rapidly as though he were struggling to stay calm. "That's absurd," Sir Henry managed, but his voice cracked, betraying his unease.
I don't know what you mean." Poirot stepped closer, his presence imposing. "Ah, but you do, Sir Henry. You've been clever, very clever, hiding behind the facade of a concerned gentleman, an innocent bystander caught in the web of Leclerc's manipulation. But your true motives have been clear from the start, if only one were willing to see them." Lady Evelyn looked between Poirot and Sir Henry, her face a mask of confusion. "But how? Why?" Poirot gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "You see, my dear Lady Evelyn, it was never about the gambling debts or the so-called rivalry between Leclerc and Turner. No, Sir Henry had his own reasons that went far beyond petty squabbles over money." The room was silent as Poirot continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of someone recounting a carefully constructed narrative. Sir Henry had much more to lose than anyone knew. His position, his reputation, these were things he could not afford to jeopardize. But there was something else, something far more personal. Poirot's gaze never wavered from Sir Henry's face, which had begun to flush with a combination of anger and guilt. The detective's voice softened, but the weight of his words carried far more impact than any shout. Sir Henry had been in a financial bind for quite some time. His investments had failed, and the once proud family estate was now teetering
on the edge of ruin. But worse still, he had a secret that he couldn't afford to let anyone discover. Sir Henry's face twitched, and for a moment it seemed as though he might break down.
But he quickly regained his composure, though the sweat now beaded on his forehead, and his hands trembled at his sides. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Leclerc, you see, had discovered this secret. He knew about Sir Henry's desperate situation, and he had been blackmailing him for months. The gambling, a cover, the game, nothing more than a ruse to keep Sir Henry under his thumb. Leclerc had been feeding him false hope, playing on his weakness, and Sir Henry had no choice but to go along with it. But that's not true, Sir Henry whispered, though it was clear from the look on his face that he knew Poirot was right. I couldn't let it get out, Poirot. I couldn't let anyone know that I was being blackmailed. The shame would have destroyed me. And so, Poirot continued, in his desperation, Sir Henry made the ultimate decision. He would remove Leclerc from the equation, but not just through any means. No, he carefully orchestrated the murder so that suspicion would fall on Turner. It was brilliant in a way. Turner's own involvement with Leclerc made him the perfect scapegoat. Lady Evelyn gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "You're telling me, Sir Henry, he—" "Yes, my dear," Poirot interrupted gently. "He played us all, manipulating the evidence and the people around him with a subtlety that is only possible when one's back is pressed against the wall. He knew that if we investigated Turner too thoroughly, the truth would be uncovered. So he set up the perfect smokescreen, knowing that the pieces of the puzzle would fit together in a way that led us away from him. But there was one thing he did not count on: my attention to detail." Sir Henry's expression was a mixture of fear and defiance as Poirot continued. "The final twist, Sir Henry, was your underestimation of the game itself. You thought you could outsmart everyone, but in the end, it was your own guilt that gave you away. The manner in which you reacted to the smallest details, the way you kept your distance from the investigation, these were the final clues I needed to see the truth. The emotional undercurrent, the desperation in your voice whenever you spoke of Leclerc's crimes, the hints of jealousy that surfaced when others were implicated. These were the signs that pointed directly to you." Sir Henry took a step back, his hand gripping the back of a chair for support. He looked as though he might collapse under the weight of the truth, but his pride held him firm. "You can't prove it," he said in a hoarse voice. "No one will believe you." Poirot's lips curled into a knowing smile.
"Ah, but that is where you are wrong, Sir Henry. You have already proven it yourself. Your guilt is written all over your face." The room was silent for a long, tense moment. Then the inspector, who had been standing off to the side, stepped
Forward, his hand poised to make the arrest. It was over. Chapter 14. Justice served. The arrest was swift. Sir Henry, though initially defiant, seemed to wilt under the weight of Poirot's unwavering certainty. The inspector moved to secure him, while the rest of the room stood in silence, the tension slowly beginning to dissipate, though the air was still thick with the remnants of the confrontation. Lady Evelyn's hands, which had been trembling ever since Poirot's revelation, slowly settled as she watched the man she had once trusted being led away. Poirot, for his part, did not immediately speak. His eyes followed the proceedings with the detached calm that had come to characterize him throughout this investigation. He had solved the puzzle, but there was no sense of triumph in his expression, only the faintest trace of a smile, one of quiet satisfaction. He turned back to the remaining guests, each of whom had their own private thoughts about the night's shocking events. "Do not be troubled, my friends," Poirot said, his voice cutting through the silence as he addressed
them.
"Justice, as you have seen, has been done. But there is more to this story than the simple unmasking of the criminal." Lady Evelyn, still reeling from the shock, stared at him, her lips trembling as though she were about to speak, but couldn't quite summon the words. Sir Henry's fall from grace had been too sudden, too complete. One moment he had been the epitome of respectability, and now, within minutes, he had become a criminal in the eyes of all present. Poirot, as always, was composed. "The man you once knew, Sir Henry, was not simply driven by greed or malice. No, his action stemmed from something far deeper. It was not a desire for power or wealth, but a thirst for control, and I dare say, for revenge." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, watching as the group shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For you see, Sir Henry's financial troubles were not simply due to poor investments or bad luck. No, they were the result of an old betrayal, one that had followed him like a shadow for years. A betrayal he could never quite forgive, and one that shaped his every decision in life. Lady Evelyn blinked, confusion still clouding her features. But how could
his need for revenge have driven him to murder?
Poirot met her gaze, his eyes filled with a certain sadness. "Ah, madam, it is often the smallest things that set off the greatest tragedies. It was not one single event, but a series of them, one after another, building upon each other until they could not be ignored. Sir Henry was a man used to having everything under control, his reputation, his finances, his personal life. But when the walls began to close in on him, he made one fatal mistake. He underestimated the lengths to which he would go to keep his secret from being exposed." The room was quiet, the weight of Poirot's words settling over them like a heavy blanket. Even now, with the case solved, the mystery of Sir Henry's motivations lingered in the air. The inspector, who had been standing nearby, nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of Poirot's assessment. He had witnessed the detective's brilliance firsthand, but there was something more, something about the nature of the crime that continued to gnaw at him. Poirot turned to the others, his voice softening. In the end, it was not Sir Henry's financial ruin that drove him to murder. It was his fear of losing everything, his fear of being exposed for the man he truly was, and that fear, paired with a deep sense of betrayal, consumed him. A heavy silence fell once more, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the distant creaking of the house, as if it, too, were breathing a sigh of relief now that the truth had come to light. Poirot took a step forward, his gaze shifting to each of the remaining guests. It is often said that people do not murder for the sake of murder itself. There is always a reason, a motive, even if it is hidden beneath layers of lies and deception. And when that motive is exposed, when the truth is finally revealed, what remains is not just the killer, but the ripple effect of their actions. Lady Evelyn's voice broke the silence, tentative but filled with a new clarity. "And what about Leclerc? Was he really just a pawn, as you suggested?" Poirot gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Leclerc was a pawn, yes, a means to an end. Sir Henry used him as a shield, knowing that his involvement in the game would lead the investigation astray. Leclerc's role was critical in giving Sir Henry the cover he needed to execute his plan without suspicion. But in the end, it was not Leclerc's death that mattered most. It was Sir Henry's ability to manipulate the people around him, to orchestrate the entire series of events, as if they were part of a well-rehearsed play." The detective's voice became more reflective, almost philosophical. "It is a tragedy, is it not? How a single moment of weakness, a single failure of character, can send a man down a path from which he cannot return. Sir Henry, in his obsession with control, lost everything that mattered. In his quest for vengeance, he destroyed not only his life, but the lives of everyone around him. There was a long pause, and Poirot's gaze drifted to the window, as though he were looking beyond the confines of the room, past the night, and into something deeper, more elusive. "We often think of crime as a simple thing," Poirot said, quietly, almost to himself. "A murder, a theft, a betrayal. But crime is a reflection of something far more complex. It is a window into the human soul, a glimpse into the darkness that can exist within even the most seemingly respectable individuals." His voice softened further, and for a moment it seemed as if Poirot were speaking not to the group in front of him, but to the world itself. Justice, you see, is not always as straightforward as it seems. It is not simply a matter of finding the killer and bringing them to account. No, true justice lies in understanding the forces that drive a person to commit such an act, to recognize the pain, the fear, and the brokenness that lie behind their actions. Lady Evelyn, who had been silent until now, spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "So, in the end, Sir Henry was a victim too. A victim of his own making." Poirot's eyes softened, and he gave a small nod. "Yes, madame, a victim of his own choices, but let us not forget he was also a killer, and justice must be served. Though the human heart is full of contradictions, we cannot allow compassion to blind us to the need for accountability." The silence that followed was filled with a sense of melancholy, a recognition that the case had been solved, but at great cost. Even as justice had been done, there was no sense of triumph, only the faintest echo of sorrow for the choices that had led Sir Henry down his dark path. And yet, as Poirot turned to leave, there was a quiet sense of closure in the air, a quiet understanding that the truth, no matter how painful, had finally come to light. As the door closed behind him, one final thought lingered in his mind, and he spoke it aloud, though it was more to himself than anyone else in the room. Crime, you see, is not always born of malice. Sometimes it is born of fear, and fear is a much more dangerous thing. Chapter 15. The Grand Dénouement. The evening was calm, almost serene, as Poirot stood by the window of the drawing-room, his gaze lingering on the rolling hills outside. The murder had been solved, but there was no joy in the victory, no triumphant gestures. For Poirot it was a puzzle completed, but one that left a lingering sense of unease. Justice had been done, yes, but at what cost? He turned back to the group of people who had gathered in the room, each of them still reeling from the night's revelations. Lady Evelyn, who had once been so confident in Sir Henry's innocence, now sat in a chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale. The inspector, too, stood in quiet contemplation, his expression sombre, as he thought of the man he had once regarded as an upstanding member of society, now facing the consequences of his crimes. Poirot cleared his throat softly, catching their attention. "I trust you all are ready to hear the truth in its entirety. The case is solved, and it is time we draw this chapter to a close." A murmur of assent passed through the group, and Poirot, as always, held their attention with his quiet command. His methodical approach to the case had left no room for doubt, and now, with Sir Henry in custody, it was time to unravel the final layers of the mystery. "I will take you step by step through what we know," Poirot began, his voice smooth and measured. The crime itself was simple enough in its execution, no complex schemes, no elaborate traps. But what made it so insidious, so difficult to solve, was the motive that lay behind it. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle on the room. When I first arrived, I noted several things that seemed out of place. The timing of the murder, the lack of forced entry, the way the body was positioned, everything pointed to someone who knew the victim intimately, someone who had a personal stake in the crime. But more than that, there was the matter of Sir Henry's involvement. Lady Evelyn's eyes flickered with a mixture of confusion and apprehension. "You mean Sir Henry wasn't the first suspect?" Poirot gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Ah, madame, you misunderstand me. Sir Henry was the first suspect, yes, but not because of his character or his past. No, it was because of the circumstances, his financial troubles, his recent disputes with the victim. These were all pieces that seemed to fit the puzzle. But they were only surface details, not the true cause of the crime." He walked over to the fireplace, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of the mantel as he spoke. As I began to dig deeper, I found something more compelling. An old rivalry, a sense of betrayal, one that had shaped Sir Henry's every decision. It was not simply a matter of money, but of something more personal, something he could never forgive. But what truly unmasked the murderer was the small detail I discovered about his relationship with Leclerc. Lady Evelyn's brow furrowed. "Leclerc? But you said he was only a pawn in Sir Henry's game." Poirot nodded, turning to face her. "Indeed. But you see, madame, the involvement of Leclerc was not as innocent as it appeared. Sir Henry had used him to distract the investigators, to plant false leads, and to divert attention from his own actions. Leclerc was the perfect scapegoat, and for a time it worked. But the key to the crime lay not in Leclerc's actions, but in the subtle shift of power between him and Sir Henry." Poirot's eyes seemed to light up with the satisfaction of the
moment. It was the moment when Leclerc threatened to expose Sir Henry's secret, the secret that had been festering for years, that everything fell apart.
Sir Henry could not allow that to happen, and so he did what was necessary to ensure his own survival. He turned toward the group, his eyes now focusing on the inspector, who stood a little straighter under the weight of Poirot's analysis. The murder itself was not a sudden outburst. It was carefully planned, the result of months, if not years, of simmering resentment. Sir Henry had made many enemies over the years, but it was the one closest to him, the one he trusted the most, who ultimately paid the price. The inspector nodded slowly, as though the pieces were falling into place in his mind. "And the victim?" Poirot's lips tightened slightly and his gaze softened. "The victim, you see, had become an obstacle, a threat to Sir Henry's carefully constructed world. In the end, the victim had to be eliminated, not because of anything personal, but because of what they knew, what they threatened to reveal." Lady Evelyn looked at Poirot with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. "So, sir, Henry killed him to protect himself?" "Exactly," Poirot replied, "and in doing so he sealed his own fate. The crime was one of desperation, not malice. But that does not make it any less criminal." The room fell silent as Poirot's words hung in the air. There was no triumph in his tone, no sense of victory. Instead, there was only a quiet acknowledgement of the complex web of human emotions that had led to this point, the unraveling of a life, the collapse of a carefully curated persona, all because of fear and the need for control. Poirot turned to face the door, his hand resting on the handle as he prepared to leave the room. "It is always the same. You—"
"No," he mused, his voice carrying a note of reflection. "The criminal does not commit murder because they are evil. No, it is the fear of losing control, the fear of being exposed that drives them to such extreme actions." Lady Evelyn
stood and walked toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. And what of justice, Monsieur Poirot? What of the consequences? Poirot met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Ah, madame, justice is a delicate thing. It does not always bring peace, nor does it always make the world right again. But it is necessary, nonetheless. Without it, there can be no order, no sense of morality. He paused, turning once more to the inspector. Sir Henry will face his punishment, as he must. But remember, the true cost of his crime was not just his actions, but the unravelling of everything he held dear. His need for control led him down a path from which there was no return. Poirot smiled faintly, his eyes softening as he turned to leave. And now, my friend, we must go. The case is closed. As he walked out of the room, the group remained still, each person lost in their own thoughts, reflecting on the intricacies of the case. Poirot's words lingered in the air, his final reflections on the nature of justice echoing in their minds. And remember, Hastings, Poirot's voice called back as he reached the door. It is the little grey cells that solve the mysteries of the world. With that, he was gone, and the room was left in quiet contemplation.